Clint Eastwood was enjoying a quiet afternoon until a smug young prosecutor decided to make the biggest mistake of his career. "Your time is over, old man," Daniel Grayson sneered, thinking he had already won. The courtroom held its breath. Cameras flashed. The world watched. But Clint, he just leaned back, smirked, and said 5 words that changed everything. "You sure about that, kid?" What happened next shattered reputations, exposed corruption, and proved why legends never fade. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open with a loud creak, and the entire room fell silent. All eyes turned to the figure standing in the doorway, Clint Eastwood. Dressed in a sharp, charcoal gray suit, he walked in with the calm, steady stride of a man who had faced far worse than a courtroom. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room, unbothered by the weight of the stares fixed on him. The air seemed to shift, as if the legend himself had brought a storm with him. At the prosecution table, Daniel Grayson, the young, cocky prosecutor, leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He whispered to his assistant, a smug glint in his eyes, "Finally, today we end the legend." His voice was low, but the confidence in it was unmistakable. Grayson had built his career on taking down big names, and Clint Eastwood was the biggest yet. Clint took his seat at the defense table, adjusting his suit jacket with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Hayes, gave him a nod. "You good?" she asked quietly. Clint simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He wasn't just good, he was ready. The case was already the talk of the town. Grayson had accused Clint of interfering in a high-profile corruption scandal, claiming the Hollywood icon had overstepped his bounds by confronting powerful businessmen. To Grayson, Clint was just an old man playing hero, a relic of a bygone era who didn't know his place. But to Clint, this was just another battlefield. He'd faced down outlaws, corrupt politicians, and even entire armies on screen. A courtroom? This was nothing. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, called for order with a sharp rap of her gavel. "This court is now in session. Prosecution, you may begin." Grayson stood, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with a flourish. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His grin widened as he turned to face Clint, his voice dripping with mockery. "Mr. Eastwood, I hope you're ready, because this is going to be the longest day of your life." The room held its breath. Clint leaned back in his chair, his face as calm as a still lake. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just met Grayson's gaze with a quiet intensity that made the younger man's smirk falter for the briefest of moments. The showdown had begun. Grayson's grin returned, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Clint Eastwood wasn't just another defendant, he was a force of nature. And Grayson was about to learn that the hard way. Grayson didn't waste a second. He stepped into the center of the courtroom like a prize fighter entering the ring, his polished shoes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The jury leaned forward, captivated, as he began his opening statement with a voice that carried the weight of someone who believed he'd already won. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Grayson began, his tone smooth but edged with accusation. "This case is about one man's reckless disregard for the law. Clint Eastwood, a man you all know, a man you may admire, decided he was above it. He took justice into his own hands, interfering in a matter that was none of his business." He paused, letting his words sink in, his eyes sweeping over the jury. They were nodding, some scribbling notes, others exchanging glances. Grayson's smirk returned. He had them. "You're not a cop, Mr. Eastwood," Grayson said, turning sharply to face Clint. "You're not a judge. So what gives you the right to interfere in this case? What gives you the right to play hero?" The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. All eyes turned to Clint, waiting for his reaction. But Clint didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, his expression as calm as ever, his hands resting lightly on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, and laced with a dry humor that caught everyone off guard. "Son," Clint said, his eyes locking onto Grayson's, "I've seen worse performances in spaghetti westerns." The courtroom erupted in laughter. Even a few jurors couldn't suppress their smiles. Grayson's smirk faltered, his confidence cracking for the first time. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Clint to be so unshakable. "Grayson, cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "This isn't a movie, Mr. Eastwood," he snapped, his voice sharper now. "This is real life, and in real life, there are consequences for your actions." Clint raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. "Funny," he said, his tone casual, almost conversational. "I was just thinking the same thing." The laughter died down, replaced by a murmur of curiosity. What did Clint mean by that? Grayson's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. "Your Honor," Grayson said, turning to the judge, "I'd like to call my first witness." The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. "Proceed." Grayson shot Clint one last glare, his eyes narrowing. Clint wasn't scared. He wasn't even worried. And that, Grayson realized with a sinking feeling, made him dangerous. Grayson turned to the bailiff, his voice tight. "Call Mr. Jonathan Hayes to the stand." The name sent a ripple through the room. Clint's lawyer, Rebecca Hayes, stiffened. Jonathan Hayes was her father and Grayson's first witness. The game had just gotten personal. The courtroom doors creaked open, and a middle-aged man in an ill-fitting suit shuffled in, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Jonathan Hayes, a businessman with a reputation for cutting shady deals, took the stand. His hands trembled as he swore to tell the truth, his voice barely above a whisper. Grayson's smirk returned. This was his first witness, and he was going to make it count. "Mr. Hayes," Grayson began, his tone smooth and confident, "can you tell the court what happened the night Clint Eastwood confronted you?" Hayes cleared his throat, his eyes flicking toward Clint before quickly looking away. He came to my office," Hayes stammered. "He was angry, said I was involved in some corruption scandal. He threatened me." Grayson raised an eyebrow, playing to the jury. "Threatened you? How so?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "He said if I didn't come clean, he'd make sure everyone knew what I'd done. He was intimidating." Grayson nodded, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. "Would you say Mr. Eastwood was violent?" The question hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Hayes hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. "No, not violent, just intense." The courtroom stirred, a murmur of curiosity rippling through the crowd. Clint, sitting at the defense table, folded his arms and leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Grayson pressed on, his voice rising. "Intense? Mr. Hayes, are you saying Clint Eastwood used his presence to intimidate you into compliance?" Hayes nodded quickly. "Yes, that's exactly what happened." Grayson turned to the jury, his smirk widening. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Your witness, Ms. Hayes." Rebecca Hayes stood, her sharp eyes locking onto Hayes. But before she could speak, Clint raised a hand, stopping her. "I've got this," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. The room fell silent as Clint stood, his towering presence commanding attention. He walked slowly toward the witness stand, his eyes never leaving Hayes. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of a man who had nothing to hide. "Mr. Hayes," Clint began, "you said I intimidated you, but let me ask you this. Why were you so scared? Was it because I was telling the truth?" Hayes blinked, caught off guard. I don't know what you mean." Clint tilted his head, his gaze piercing. "Maybe you were scared because you were lying. Maybe you were scared because you knew I had proof." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Hayes's face turned pale, his hands gripping the edge of the stand. I didn't," Clint cut him off, his voice steady. "You didn't think I'd call you out? You didn't think I'd show everyone what you really are?" Grayson shot to his feet, his face red. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Overruled. Continue. Mr. Eastwood." Clint didn't miss a beat. "You're not a victim, Mr. Hayes. You're a liar, and everyone here knows it." The room buzzed with tension, the jury leaning forward, their eyes wide. Clint had turned the tables in seconds, and Grayson knew it. Grayson glared at Clint, his voice tight with fury. "You think you can play games, Mr. Eastwood? Let's see how you handle this." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit A, security footage of the confrontation." The screen flickered to life, and the courtroom held its breath. But as the video played, something unexpected appeared, something that would change everything. The courtroom screen flickered to life, casting a pale glow over the tense faces in the room. Grayson stood at the center, his confidence radiating as he gestured to the footage. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice dripping with triumph. "What you're about to see is undeniable proof of Clint Eastwood's reckless interference." The video played, showing Clint standing in a dimly lit office, his towering frame looming over a group of nervous-looking businessmen. His voice, low and steady, carried through the speakers. "You think you can hide behind your money and power?" Clint said, his eyes narrowing. "You're wrong." Grayson paused the video, turning to the jury with a dramatic flourish. "Look at him. He's threatening them. This is not the behavior of a law-abiding citizen. This is the behavior of a vigilante who thinks he's above the law." The jury leaned forward, their eyes glued to the screen. A few exchanged glances, their expressions uneasy. Grayson's smirk widened. He had them right where he wanted them. But Clint, sitting at the defense table, didn't look worried. In fact, he looked amused. He leaned over to his lawyer, Rebecca Hayes, and whispered something. She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Grayson noticed the exchange, and his confidence wavered for a split second. But he pressed on, determined to drive his point home. "Your Honor, this footage clearly shows Mr. Eastwood intimidating these men. I rest my case." The judge leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Does the defense have anything to add?" Clint stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to the center of the room, his presence commanding silence. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I'd like to request that the full tape be played." Grayson's smirk faltered. "Objection. This is irrelevant." The judge raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds, Mr. Grayson?" Grayson hesitated, his mind racing. The footage speaks for itself. There's no need to prolong this." Clint turned to Grayson, his eyes glinting with a quiet intensity. "If the footage speaks for itself, then you shouldn't have a problem showing all of it." The judge nodded. "Overruled. Play the full tape." The room fell silent as the video resumed. The footage showed Clint stepping closer to the businessman, his voice steady but firm. "You think I'm here to threaten you?" he said, his tone shifting. "I'm here to give you a chance. Come clean, or I'll make sure the whole world knows what you've done." One of the businessmen, his face pale, stammered, We didn't mean to." Clint cut him off. "Save it. I've got proof. Emails, bank records, everything. You're done." The video continued, showing Clint handing over a folder to one of the men. "Take this to the authorities," he said, "or I will." The room erupted in murmurs. The jury's expressions shifted from unease to surprise. Even Grayson looked stunned, his confidence crumbling as the full context of the footage became clear. Clint turned to the jury, his voice calm but powerful. "I wasn't threatening them. I was giving them a chance to do the right thing. And when they refused, I made sure the truth came out." Grayson's face turned red, his hands clenching into fists. This changes nothing," he sputtered, his voice rising. "You still interfered." Clint raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Interfered? Or exposed the truth? You tell me, counselor." The jury exchanged glances, their earlier unease replaced by curiosity. One juror, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her tone pointed, "why didn't you show us the full tape?" Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His confidence was shattered, his case unraveling before his eyes. The judge leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Mr. Grayson, care to explain why you withheld crucial evidence?" The room fell silent, every eye fixed on Grayson as he struggled to find an answer. The jury's trust in him was crumbling, and Clint was just getting started. The courtroom was electric with tension, the air thick enough to choke on. Grayson, his face flushed and his confidence crumbling, paced in front of the jury like a caged animal. He was losing control, and he knew it. Desperation flickered in his eyes as he turned to Clint, his voice sharp and biting. "Mr. Eastwood," Grayson began, his tone dripping with disdain, "let's cut to the chase. Aren't you just a washed-up old actor looking for attention? Is that what this is about? A desperate attempt to stay relevant?" The courtroom gasped, the shock rippling through the room like a wave. Even the judge raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. Grayson's personal attack was a risky move, one that reeked of panic. Clint, however, didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, his expression as calm as a still lake. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and laced with a quiet authority that silenced the room. "Son," Clint said, his eyes locking onto Grayson's, "I've been underestimated before. It never ends well. The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. The jury, once leaning forward in anticipation, now exchanged uneasy glances. Grayson's attempt to rattle, if Clint had backfired, spectacularly. One juror, a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard, let out a low chuckle. It was soft at first, but it spread like wildfire. Soon the entire courtroom was laughing, not with Grayson, but at him. Grayson's face turned crimson, his hands clenching into fists. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The jury's laughter was a verdict in itself. The judge rapped her gavel, her voice sharp. "Order! Mr. Grayson, do you have anything else to add?" Grayson stood frozen, his career hanging by a thread, as Clint's quiet confidence filled the room. The jury's laughter had sealed his fate, and the trial was far from over. The courtroom was silent, the tension so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. Grayson stood frozen, his face pale as Clint's lawyer, Rebecca Hayes, rose from her seat. Her sharp eyes locked onto Grayson, and when she spoke, her voice cut through the room like a blade. "Prosecutor Grayson," she began, her tone calm but deadly, "is it true that you received a substantial donation from the same businessmen you've accused my client of confronting?" Grayson's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the podium. That's irrelevant," he stammered, his voice losing its usual confidence. Clint, sitting at the defense table, leaned forward, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. "Irrelevant? Son, it's very relevant." The judge raised an eyebrow, her gaze shifting between Grayson and Rebecca. "Counselor, do you have evidence to support this claim?" Rebecca nodded, holding up a thick manila envelope. "We do, Your Honor. This document shows a $50,000 donation from Jonathan Hayes, one of the businessmen in question, to Grayson's campaign fund. The timing coincides with the start of this case." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Grayson's face turned ashen, his eyes darting to the jury. They were no longer nodding along with him. They were staring at him with suspicion. Rebecca handed the document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. As the judge scanned the papers, her expression grew darker. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice sharp, "care to explain this?" Grayson opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hands trembled as he gripped the podium, his mind racing for a way out. Clint stood, his towering presence commanding the room. "Looks like the real corruption wasn't in the boardroom," he said, his voice steady but laced with quiet fury. "It was in your office." The jury's eyes widened, their trust in Grayson crumbling with every passing second. One juror, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her tone icy, "did you take a bribe to prosecute an innocent man?" Grayson's face flushed, his confidence shattered. He looked like a man who had just been punched in the gut. The judge slammed her gavel, her voice booming. "This court will take a recess. Mr. Grayson, you'd better have an explanation, and it had better be good." Grayson stood frozen, his career hanging by a thread, as Clint's quiet triumph filled the room. The tables had turned, and Grayson was out of moves. The courtroom buzzed with tension, the air thick with unspoken questions. The jurors, once united in their focus on Clint, now whispered among themselves, their faces etched with doubt. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair leaned over to the woman beside him, his voice low. "Did you see that? Grayson took money from the same people he's prosecuting." The woman nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Something's not right here." At the front of the room, the judge leaned forward, her sharp eyes fixed on Grayson. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "explain yourself." Grayson stood at the podium, his usual confidence replaced by visible unease. His hands gripped the edges as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "Your Honor, I can explain," he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of the room's scrutiny. Clint, sitting at the defense table, watched with quiet satisfaction. He didn't need to say a word. The jury was already turning. One juror, a young man with piercing blue eyes, leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "This whole case feels off," he muttered to the woman next to him. "Why are we even here?" The judge's voice snapped like a whip. "Mr. Grayson, I'm waiting." Grayson opened his mouth, but no coherent words came out. His eyes darted to the jury, then to Clint, then back to the judge. It's a misunderstanding," he finally managed, his voice weak. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. One by one, their trust in Grayson evaporated. A juror in the back row, a stern-faced woman with graying hair, shook her head slowly. "We're done here," she whispered, loud enough for the others to hear. Grayson's case and his career were crumbling before his eyes. The courtroom was a powder keg, every eye fixed on Grayson as he stood at the podium, his face pale but determined. Desperation had taken hold, and he was running out of options. With a shaky hand, he gestured to the bailiff. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a new witness to the stand." The judge raised an eyebrow, her voice sharp. "Mr. Grayson, this is highly irregular. Who is this witness?" Grayson straightened his tie, his voice gaining a sliver of its former confidence. "A Mr. Thomas Reed, Your Honor. He has critical information about Mr. Eastwood's questionable activities." The doors swung open, and a nervous-looking man in a cheap suit shuffled in. He avoided eye contact with everyone, especially Clint, as he took the stand. Grayson wasted no time. "Mr. Reed," Grayson began, his tone dripping with false sincerity, "can you tell the court what you know about Clint Eastwood's involvement in bribery?" Reed fidgeted, his voice trembling. I saw him hand over an envelope to a city official. It looked like a bribe." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Grayson's smirk returned, though it was weaker than before. "No further questions, Your Honor." Clint, sitting at the defense table, leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. He turned to Rebecca Hayes, his lawyer, and whispered, "You ready?" She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Ready." Rebecca stood, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Mr. Reed," she began, her tone icy, "is it true that you were paid $10,000 by Prosecutor Grayson's office to testify today?" The room erupted in gasps. Reed's face turned ashen, his hands gripping the edge of the stand. I don't know what you're talking about." Rebecca didn't blink. She held up a document, her voice steady. "This is a bank statement showing a transfer from Grayson's campaign fund to your account, dated 2 days ago. Care to explain?" Reed's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Grayson shot to his feet, his face red. "Objection! This is irrelevant." The judge slammed her gavel. "Overruled. Mr. Reed, answer the question." Reed looked at Grayson, then at the jury, then at Clint. Finally, he broke. I was paid to lie," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The courtroom exploded. Jurors stood, reporters scrambled for their cameras, and Grayson looked like he'd been sucker punched. The judge's voice boomed over the chaos. "Bailiff, detain Mr. Reed. And as for you, Mr. Grayson," she turned to him, her eyes blazing, "you're under investigation for witness tampering and obstruction of justice." The room erupted again as Grayson's world crumbled around him. The courtroom was in chaos. Reporters shouted questions, jurors exchanged frantic whispers, and Grayson stood frozen at the podium, his face pale and his hands trembling. The judge slammed her gavel repeatedly, her voice cutting through the noise like a whip. "Order! I will have order in this court!" The room slowly quieted, but the tension was palpable. Rebecca Hayes, Clint's lawyer, stood, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, in light of the prosecution's blatant misconduct, we move to have this case dismissed immediately." The judge leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She took a deep breath, her expression unreadable. "This court has never seen such a blatant abuse of power," she said, her voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "Mr. Grayson, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Grayson opened his mouth, but no words came out. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by sheer panic. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on thin ice, and it was cracking beneath him. Clint, sitting at the defense table, watched with quiet satisfaction. He didn't need to say a word. The truth was doing the talking for him. The judge turned to the jury, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I have serious concerns about the prosecution's integrity. The evidence presented today raises questions that cannot be ignored." One juror, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Your Honor, are you saying this case is compromised?" The judge nodded, her expression grim. "I'm saying that the actions of the prosecution have cast a shadow over these proceedings. It is this court's duty to ensure justice is served, not manipulated." Grayson finally found his voice, though it was weak and shaky. "Your Honor, I can explain. This is all a misunderstanding." The judge's eyes narrowed. "A misunderstanding? Mr. Grayson, you paid a witness to lie under oath. That's not a misunderstanding? That's a crime." The room erupted again, but the judge silenced it with another slam of her gavel. "This case is dismissed," she declared, her voice final. And Mr. Grayson, consider yourself under investigation for obstruction of justice and witness tampering. Grayson's face turned white, his hands gripping the podium for support. His career, his reputation, his future, all of it was crumbling before his eyes. As the bailiff approached Grayson, Clint stood, his voice cutting through the noise. Your Honor, there's one more thing. The room fell silent as Clint held up a folder. This is proof of Grayson's involvement in the corruption scandal he accused me of exposing. Grayson's knees buckled. His downfall was just beginning. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, every second stretching into an eternity. The jury had been deliberating for hours and the tension was unbearable. Grayson sat slumped at the prosecution table, his once pristine suit now wrinkled, his face pale and drawn. Clint, on the other hand, sat calmly at the defense table, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. The room buzzed with whispered speculation, but Clint's quiet confidence never wavered. Finally, the door to the jury room creaked open, and the jurors filed back in, their faces solemn. The foreman, a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard, held a single sheet of paper in his hand. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him as he stood. Madam Foreperson, the judge said, her voice steady, has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman nodded, his voice clear and strong. We have, Your Honor. Clint's lawyer, Rebecca Hayes, reached over and squeezed his hand. He gave her a small nod, his eyes never leaving the foreman. The foreman unfolded the paper and took a deep breath. In the case of the state versus Clint Eastwood, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Cheers, applause, and gasps filled the air as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Clint remained seated, a small smile playing on his lips. He didn't need to celebrate. Justice had spoken for itself. Grayson, however, looked like he'd been hit by a truck. He sat frozen at the prosecution table, his hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. His career, his reputation, his future, all of it was shattered in an instant. The judge slammed her gavel, calling for order. Mr. Eastwood, she said, her voice carrying over the noise, you are free to go. Clint stood, his towering presence commanding the room. He turned to Grayson, his voice calm, but laced with quiet triumph. Told you, kid. Underestimating me was your first mistake. Grayson didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, his mind racing, his world crumbling around him. As Clint walked out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed him, shouting questions. He paused, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. I didn't need to win this case, he said, his voice steady. The truth did that for me. The crowd parted as Clint made his way to the exit, his head held high. Behind him, Grayson remained seated, his face buried in his hands. As Clint stepped into the sunlight, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, revealing a familiar face. Need a ride, Clint? The driver asked. Clint smirked. Depends. You got a plan for what's next? The driver grinned. Oh, we've got a plan. Grayson's downfall was just the beginning. The gavel struck the judge's bench with a sharp crack, silencing the murmurs that rippled through the courtroom. Every eye in the room was fixed on Judge Reynolds, her stern expression colder than the marble pillars surrounding her. She leaned forward, fingers steepled, her gaze locking onto Grayson like a predator, assessing wounded prey. Mr. Grayson, she said, her voice carrying the weight of finality, this court has spent weeks deliberating over your case against Mr. Eastwood. And yet, in the end, it is not he who stands accused. A hush fell over the room. Grayson's face was a mask of barely restrained panic, beads of sweat glistening on his brow. His once confident posture had crumbled, shoulders hunched, fingers gripping the edge of the prosecution table like it was the only thing keeping him afloat. The judge's eyes narrowed. It is now clear that you not only manipulated evidence, but also engaged in witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and a direct abuse of power. Therefore, effective immediately, this court is launching a formal ethics investigation into your conduct. A gasp spread through the crowd like wildfire. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and the jury exchanged knowing glances. It was over. The golden boy of the prosecution had officially fallen. Grayson opened his mouth, searching for a rebuttal, but no words came. The color drained from his face as the reality of his situation sank in. His career, the reputation he had built, the power he had wielded, was crumbling like sand, slipping through his fingers. Judge Reynolds wasn't finished. Mr. Grayson, she continued, flipping through a file with slow, deliberate movements. This court does not take misconduct lightly. Should these allegations be confirmed, you will face not only disbarment, but also criminal charges. The air in the courtroom was suffocating. Grayson swayed slightly, gripping the table tighter. His breathing had become shallow, his pulse hammering against his temple. Rebecca Hayes, Clint's lawyer, crossed her arms and tilted her head. Guess justice works both ways, huh? She murmured, loud enough for only Clint to hear. Clint, who had been watching the entire spectacle with quiet amusement, leaned back in his chair, his rugged face impassive. Then ever so slightly he leaned forward, just enough for Grayson to hear him. Told you, kid, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but heavy with satisfaction. Grayson flinched as if the words had struck him. His gaze darted to Clint, full of something that teetered between hatred and defeat. The judge slammed her gavel one final time. Court is adjourned. As the court empitory, a reporter rushed toward Grayson, microphone extended. Mr. Grayson, any comment on the investigation? Grayson swallowed hard, sweat dripping from his brow, but before he could answer, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and turned ghostly white. The caller ID read, Office of the Attorney General. The heavy doors of the courthouse swung open, and Clint Eastwood stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, his face as calm as ever. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the marble steps. A sea of reporters stood waiting, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. The world wanted a statement, a reaction, anything. Clint simply took a deep breath, adjusting his suit jacket with the slow confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. The courtroom battle was over, and the truth had spoken for itself. Mr. Eastwood, a reporter shouted, pushing forward. How does it feel to be a free man? Clint glanced at the cameras, his blue eyes unreadable. Then with a slight smirk, he said, I didn't need to win. The truth did that for me. The crowd erupted into murmurs. Some reporters scrambled to jot down his words, while others pressed forward with more questions, their voices overlapping in a frenzy. Did you expect Grayson to fall apart like that? What's next for you? Do you feel vindicated? Clint took a slow step down the stairs, his boots clicking against the stone. He gave the crowd a final glance, then said, Sometimes you just have to let the truth handle itself. With that, he strode past them, the air of a man who had already moved on. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Daniel Grayson sat alone in the now empty courtroom. His hands trembled as he stared at his phone screen. The words, Office of the Attorney General, urgent, glared back at him like a death sentence. His career, his entire future, was collapsing like a house of cards in a storm. With a shaking breath, he pressed decline. His resignation letter already sat on the judge's desk, a mere formality at this point. The ethics investigation would ruin him either way. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Clint's words echoed. Told you, kid. He clenched his fists, but there was nothing left to fight for. Back outside, Clint strolled toward the curb, where a black SUV idled. The tinted window rolled down, and a familiar face smirked from the driver's seat. Need a ride? The man asked. Clint chuckled. Depends. You got a plan? The man grinned. Oh, we've got a plan. As Clint stepped into the SUV, the cameras continued to flash. The entire trial, every twist, every downfall, had gone viral. Social media exploded, the headlines screaming one thing loud and clear. Clint Eastwood just made history again.